Two Dogmas of Empiricism, Willard Van Orman Quine. Modern empiricism has been conditioned in large part by two dogmas. One is a belief in some fundamental cleavage between truths which are analytic or grounded in meanings independently of the belief that each meaningful statement is equivalent to some logical construct upon terms which refer to immediate experience. Oh, forgive me. One belief is I was like one belief is in some fundamental cleavage between truths which are analytic or grounded in meanings independently of matters of fact and truths which are synthetic or grounded in facts, mathematical or logical. The other dogma is reductionism, the belief that each meaningful statement is equivalent to some logical construct upon terms which refer to immediate experience. Both dogmas, I shall argue, are ill founded. One effect of abandoning them is, as we shall see, a blurring of the supposed boundary between speculative metaphysics and natural science. Another effect is a shift toward pragmatism. Background for analyticity. Kant's cleavage between analytic and synthetic truths was foreshadowed in Hume's distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact, and in Leibniz's distinction between truths of reason and truths of fact. Leibniz spoke of the truths of reason as true in all possible worlds. Picturesqueness aside, this is to say that the truths of reason are those which could not possibly be false. In the same vein, we hear analytic statements defined as statements whose denials are self contradictory. This definition has small explanatory value for the notion of self contradictoriness in the quite broad sense needed for this definition of analyticity stands in exactly the same need of clarification as does the notion of analyticity itself. The two notions are the two sides of a single dubious coin. Kant conceived of an analytic statement as one that attributes to its subject no more than is already conceptually contained in the object. This formulation has two shortcomings. It limits itself to statements of subject predicate form, and it appeals to a notion of containment which is left at a metaphorical level. But Kant's intent, evident more from the use he makes of the notion of analyticity than from his definition of it, can be restated thus. A statement is analytic when it is true by virtue of meanings and independently of fact. Pursuing this line, let us examine the concept of meaning which is presupposed. We must observe to begin with that meaning is not to be identified with naming or reference. Consider Frége's example of evening star and morning star. Understood not merely as a recurring evening apparition, but as a body, Venus. The evening star is the planet Venus, and the morning star is the same. The two singular terms name the same thing, but the meanings must be treated as distinct since the identity evening star is equal to morning star is a statement of fact established by astronomical observation. If evening star and morning star were alike in meaning, the identity evening star is equal to morning star would be analytic. 1961. Okay, maybe let's read this. Again, there is Russell's example of Scott and the author of Waverley. Analysis of the meanings of the words was by no means sufficient to reveal to George IV the person named by these two singular terms was one and the same. The distinction between meaning and naming is no less important at the level of abstract terms. The terms nine and quote, the number of planets name one and the same abstract entity, but presumably must be regarded as unlike in meaning. For astronomical observation was needed, and not mere reflection of meanings to determine the sameness of the entity in question. Thus far, we have been considering singular terms. 1961. Meaning, let us remember, is not to be identified with naming. Frége's example of evening star and morning star, and Russell's Scott and the author of Waverley illustrate that terms can name the same thing but differ in meaning. The distinction between meaning and naming is no less important at the level of abstract terms. The terms nine and the number of planets name one and the same abstract entity, but presumably must be regarded as unlike in meaning, for astronomical observation was needed and not mere reflection on meanings to determine the sameness of the entity in question. The above examples consist of singular terms, concrete and abstract. With general terms or predicates, the situation is somewhat different but parallel. Whereas a singular term purports to name an entity, abstract or concrete, a general term does not, but a general term is true of an entity, or each of many, or of none. The class of all entities of which a general term is true is called the extension of the term. Now, paralleling the contrast between the meaning of a singular term and the entity used, we must distinguish equally between the meaning of a general term and its extension. The general terms creature with a heart and creature with a kidney, for example, are perhaps alike in extension, but unlike in meaning. Confusion of meaning with extension, in the case of general terms, is less common than confusion of meaning with confusion of meaning with extension, in the case of general terms, is less common than confusion of meaning with naming in the case of singular terms. In general terms. Okay. It is indeed a commonplace in philosophy to oppose intention or meaning to extension, or a variant vocabulary, connotation to denotation. The Aristotelian notion of essence was the forerunner, no doubt, of modern notion of intention or meaning. For Aristotle, it was essential in man to be rational, accidental to be two-legged. But there is an important difference between this attitude and the doctrine of meaning. From the latter point of view, it may indeed be considered, if only for the sake of argument, that rationality is involved in the meaning of the word man, while two-leggedness is not. But two-leggedness may at the same time be viewed as involved in the meaning of biped, while rationality is not. Thus, from the point of view of the doctrine of meaning, it makes no sense to say of the actual lived individual, who is at once a man and a biped, that his rationality is essential and his two-leggedness accidental, or vice versa. Things, things had essences for Aristotle, but only linguistic forms have meanings. Meaning is what essence becomes when it is divorced from the object of reference and wedded to the word. For the theory of meaning, the most conspicuous question is as to the nature of its objects. What sort of things are meanings? 1951. They are evidently intended to be ideas, somehow, mental ideas, or some semanticists, Platonic ideas for others. Objects of either sort are so elusive, not to say debatable, that there seems little hope of erecting a fruitful science about them. It is not even clear, granted meanings, when we have two and when we have one. It is not clear when linguistic forms should be regarded as synonymous for alike in meaning, and when they should not. If a standard of synonymy should be arrived at, we may reasonably expect that the appeal to meanings as entities will not have played a very useful part in the enterprise. A felt need for meant entities may derive from an earlier failure to appreciate the meaning and reference. An earlier failure to appreciate that meaning and reference are distinct. Once the theory of meaning is sharply separated from the theory of reference, is a short step of recognizing as the business of the theory of meaning simply the synonymy of linguistic forms and the analyticity of statements, meanings themselves as obscure intermediary entities, may well be abandoned. A felt need for meant entities may derive from an earlier failure to appreciate that meaning and reference are distinct. Once a theory of meaning is sharply separated from a theory of reference, it is a short step to recognizing as the business of the theory of meaning simply as the synonymy of linguistic forms and the analyticity of statements, meanings themselves as obscure intermediary entities, may well be abandoned. 1951, the description of analyticity as truth by virtue of meanings started us off in pursuit of a concept of meaning. But now we have abandoned the thought of any special realm of entities called meanings. So the problem of analyticity confronts us anew. 1961, the problem of analyticity confronts us anew. Statements which are analytic by general philosophical acclaim are not, indeed, far to seek. They fall into two classes. Those of the first class, which may be called logically true, are typified by no unmarried man is married. The relevant feature of this example is that it is not merely true as it stands, but remains true under any and all reinterpretations of man and married. If we suppose a prior inventory of logical particles comprising no, an, if, an prefix, if, then, and, etc., then in general, a logical truth is a statement which is true and remains true under all reinterpretations of its components other than the logical particles. There is also a second class of analytic statements typified by no bachelor is married. The characteristic of such a statement is that it can be turned into a logical truth by putting synonyms for synonyms. Thus, two can be turned into by putting unmarried man in synonym for its synonym, bachelor. We still lack a proper characterization of this second class of analytic statements, and therewith of analyticity generally, inasmuch as we have had in the above description to lean on a notion of synonymy, which is no less in need of clarification than analyticity itself. In recent years, Carnap has tended to explain analyticity by appeal to what he calls state descriptions. A state description is any exhaustive assignment of truth values to the atomic or non-compound statements of the language. All other statements of the language are, Carnap assumes, built up of their component clauses by means of the familiar logical devices in such a way that the truth value of any complex statements is fixed for each state description by specifiable logical laws. A statement is then explained as analytic when it comes out true under every state description. This account is an adaptation of Leibniz' true in all possible worlds, but note that this version of analyticity serves its purpose only in the atomic statements of the language, only if the atomic statements of the language are, unlike John is a bachelor and John is married, mutual. But note that this version of analyticity serves its purpose only if the atomic statements of the language are, unlike John is a bachelor and John is married, mutually independent. Otherwise, there will be a state description which assigned truth to John is a bachelor and falsity to John is married, and consequently all bachelors are married. Would turn out synthetic rather than analytic under the proposed criterion. Thus, the criterion of analyticity in terms of state descriptions serves only for languages devoid of extralogical synonym pairs, such as bachelor and unmarried man. Synonym pairs of the type which give rise to the second class of analytic statements. The criterion in terms of state descriptions is a reconstruction of best of logical truth. I do not mean to suggest that Carnap is under any illusions on this point. His simplified model language with its state descriptions is aimed primarily not at the general problem of analyticity, but at another purpose, the clarification of probability and induction. Our problem, however, is analyticity, and here the major difficulty lies not in the first class of analytic statements, the logical truths, but rather in the second class, which depends on the notion of synonymy. 2. Definition. There are those who find it soothing to say that the analytic statements of the second class reduce to those of the first class, the logical truths by definition. Bachelor, for example, is defined as unmarried man. But how do we find that bachelor is defined as unmarried man? Who defined thus? Who defined it thus and when? Are we to appeal to the nearest dictionary and accept the lexicographer's formulation as law? Clearly, this would be to put the cart before the horse. The lexicographer is an empirical scientist whose business is the recording of antecedent facts, and if he glosses bachelor as unmarried man, it's because of his belief that there is a relation of synonymy between these forms, implicit in general or preferred usage prior to his own work. The notion of synonymy is presupposed here has still to be clarified, presumably in terms relating to linguistic behavior. Certainly, the definition, which is the lexicographer's report of an observed synonymy, cannot be taken as the ground of the synonymy. Definition is not indeed an activity exclusive to philologists. Philologists, philosophers, and scientists frequently have occasions to define a recondite term by rephrasing it into terms of a more familiar vocabulary. But ordinarily, such a definition, like the philologists, is purely lexicography, affirming a relationship of synonymy antecedent to the exposition in hand. Just what it means to affirm synonymy, just what the interconnections may be, which are necessary and sufficient in order for two linguistic forms to be properly describable as synonymous, is far from clear. But whatever these interconnections may be, ordinarily they are grounded in usage. Definitions reporting selected instances of synonymy come then as reports upon usage. There is also, however, a variant type of definitional activity which does not limit itself to the reporting of pre-existing synonymies. I have in mind what Carnap calls explication, an activity to which philosophers are given, and scientists also in their more philosophical moments. In explication, the purpose is not merely to paraphrase the definiendum into an outright synonym, but actually to improve upon the definiendum by refining or supplementing its meaning. That even explication, though not merely reporting a pre-existing synonymy between defiendum and definiens, does rest nevertheless on other pre-existing synonymies. The matter may be viewed as follows. Any word worth explicating has some contexts which, as wholes, are clear and precise enough to be useful, and the purpose of explication is to preserve the usage of these favored contexts while sharpening the usage of other contexts. In order that a given definition be suitable for purposes of explication, therefore, what is required is not that the definiendum in its antecedent usage be synonymous with the definiens, but just that each of these favored contexts of the definiendum, taken as a whole in its antecedent usage, be synonymous with the corresponding context of the definiens. Two alternative definientia may be equally appropriate for the purposes of a given task of explication, and yet not be synonymous with each other, for they may serve interchangeably within the favored contexts but diverge elsewhere. By cleaving to one of these definientia rather than the other, a definition of explicative kind generates, by fiat, a relationship of synonymy between definiendum and definiens which did not hold before. Such a definition still owes its explicative function as seen pre-existing synonymies. There does, however, remain still an extreme sort of definition which does not hark back to our synonymies at all, namely the explicitly conventional introduction of novel notation for purposes of sheer abbreviation.